we're going to get started. Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for sharing where you're dialing in from today. It's so exciting to see all of you here. I'm Alex. I'm on the customer support team here at Meetup. Welcome to the last Meetup Live event of the year. Today, we're going to be joined by a special guest. I'm really excited to welcome Lisa Cron. She's the author of Wired for Story, Story Genius, and most recently, Story or Die, How to Use Brain Science to Engage, Persuade, and Change Minds in Business and in Life. During this event, Lisa will help you zero in on writing strategies that will make readers want to keep going. It's not always about beautiful writing, and we'll learn how to get it on the page. And by the end, you'll be able to hone in on what your story is really about before you start writing. Or if you're in the midst of your umpteenth rewrite, before you write another word. You'll not only produce a more powerful narrative, chances are you'll drastically reduce your rewrite time. We're gonna show you the guidelines and agenda for today's event. All right, so here are some frequently asked questions just to give everybody a sense of what to expect here. This video is going to be recorded and you will not appear on the video. Your audio is going to be muted during the event. If you have questions, at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A prompt. Feel free to submit those questions in the Q&A. We'll have 15 minutes at the end. We might also make time during the workshop to make time for Q&A. And last but not least, closed captioning is available. If you'd like to turn it on, click on the live transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preference. So after this 5-minute introduction here at the top, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa. She's going to handle the storytelling workshop portion for about 40 minutes. And then, like I said, we'll make time for Q&A at the end for about 15 minutes. And I see Donna is asking in the chat, will this be available for reviewing? And yes, so we'll make sure that link is probably going to be posted on the blog. We'll be talking about that at the end of the presentation as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lisa. In addition to the books I already mentioned, and we'll talk about them again at the end of the event today, Lisa Cron led a TEDx talk called Wired for Story, which opened Furman University's 2014 TEDx conference. She spent a decade in publishing and has been a literary agent, a television producer, and a story analyst for Hollywood studios. She served on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts MFA program in visual narrative, and since 2006, she has taught in the UCLA Extension Writers Program. In her work as a private story coach, Lisa works with writers, nonprofits, educators, and organizations, helping them master the unparalleled power of story. I'm very excited to welcome today Lisa Cron. Lisa, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you. It is a utter and total and complete pleasure to be here, because there is absolutely nothing that I love more than being in a room full of writers, because writers, you guys, you are the most powerful people on the planet. Why? Because story is the most powerful communication tool in the world, because we think in story. We make sense of everything through narrative. Story is built into the architecture of our brain. That's why you have the power to change how your reader sees the world, how they see themselves, what they go out and do in the world, simply by allowing them to experience life through your protagonist's subjective reality as she struggles with that tough story problem that you're going to throw at her, or better yet, probably that she will have brought on herself. And that's a tremendous amount of power, probably more power than you know you have at this moment. But there's always a catch. There's always a caveat, and that is you have to have actually told a story. And that's my topic. My topic, what I talk about, what I'm passionate about, is story, not writing itself, but story itself. And you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute, like less than 30 seconds ago, didn't you just say that we're wired for story, that is built into the architecture of our brain? So why do we have to think about story at all? Why can't we talk about writing? And that takes us into the fine print. Here's the fine print. Yes, we're wired for story. We make sense of everything through narrative. And yes, we are wired to be riveted by a story. But when it comes to being able to create the kind of story that is capable of riveting other people, that's a learned skill. I think it's why the great Southern writer Flannery O'Connor, she once quipped in an interview, she said, I find most people know what a story is. until they sit down to write one. And I can't tell you how true I have found that. I have worked with writers and stories for more decades than, frankly, I want to admit to being alive. And in that time, I can't tell you how many manuscripts I've read, or if you asked me, what's it about? I'd say, it's about 300 pages. I have no idea. It's just a bunch of things that happen. So the question is, why does that happen? Why is that true? And I think the answer is because everything you've been taught about writing is wrong. And I know that's a really incendiary statement. So let's sort of dive into that. I mean, first of all, when you decided you wanted to write and you wanted to be a successful writer, what was the first thing that occurred to you to do and other people would encourage you to do? And that is, if you want to be a successful writer, you need to learn to write well. And I promise you, we're not going to spend the next 40 minutes delving into like how to write poorly, because that's what works. But let's go a little bit further. Let's dive into that. When we talk about writing well, what does that tend to be taken to mean? And it's taken to mean, well, you're going to come up with an interesting premise, interesting characters. You're going to learn how to write a scene. You're going to learn how to write realistic sounding dialogue. You're going to learn story structure along the way. You're going to learn to write lovely, luscious metaphors. And then you're going to learn how to like sprinkle in all of those sensory details, because, that's what they tell you brings a story to life. And once you've kind of mastered and memorized all of that external technique, then you're going to unleash your creativity, and somehow, by magic, a story is going to appear. If you have the talent. If not, oh well. And here's the thing, it doesn't work that way. All of those writing techniques, everything external that has to do with writing, is the handmaiden of story, not the other way around. Because do you know what the storyless, beautifully written novels are known as in the trade? They're known as a beautifully written, so what? A perfectly penned, who cares? I mean, ask yourself, if beautiful writing and writing well was really what the brain was hungry for and what captivated us, and what I used to say here is, and this was a long time ago, obviously, would the Da Vinci Code really be the 8th best-selling novel of all time, which of course it no longer is? What I say now is, would the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy really have sold, and I hope you're sitting down, 165 million copies and counting? 165 million copies. I mean, to put that into context, here in the US, that is 5 million more people than voted in our last election. That is a lot of people. Even if only half those people read it, it is still a massive number. And what does everybody say about those books? Really poorly written, couldn't put it down. And they are poorly written. I mean, I actually read 50 Shades of Grey because Donald Moss and I, who also writes about writing, we got together at one point quite a while ago and decided to write what we thought was a one-part post for a really great, writing site, The Writer Unboxed. And it was going to be called 50 Things That Writers Can Learn from 50 Shades of Grey. And I think we stopped at about 73 things. And by then it was a 3-part post. And we thought, just got to get back to our lives. Enough of this. But it really is poorly written. You can run it through, those Amazon searches where you can like search for how many times a certain phrase is in a novel. The intrepid heroine, Anastasia Steele, she says, holy crap, 40 times, that's 40 times in the first volume alone, 40 times. Holy crap is an expression you should only say once in your whole entire life. If you've already said it, I don't care if you were 7 years old on the playground at school, you've used your quota. You can't say it again. She says, inner goddess, so many times. If you used it for a drinking game, you'd be in rehab before you were halfway through the book. They really are poorly written. But 165 million people. Now, there are 2 ways to look at that. One is to go, okay, that's 165 million really stupid people, and I'm not writing for them. I'm not quite sure who that leaves. The other way to look at it would go, wait a minute, maybe there is something else that's pulling us in as opposed to writing well and beautiful writing. The question is, why don't we know that? Why do we think it's about becoming a wordsmith? Why don't we understand it's about story? And there are 2 reasons for that. One has to do with how we're wired, because the first job of an effective story, and I say effective as opposed to good story, because good's a value judgment, and an effective story is one that pulls us right in. The first job of an effective story is to literally biologically anesthetize the part of your brain that is a story. And I know you know that feeling where you're lost in a story, and it is stories, the world's first virtual reality. You really are there in that 360-degree sense of reality, of being somewhere, not sitting in the chair reading the book. And when you're in that state, the last thing you can do, or for that matter, want to do, is figure out how the writer has created that sense of reality that you are now living in. But in that state, there are two things that you can see. And the first thing is the writing, the words on the page. And it's very easy to think that that's what's doing it. I mean, I'm sure you've all had this experience. I know I have. It's like, you're reading a novel and you love it and you finish it and you think, oh my God, I love that writer. She's so funny. She's so wry. She's so insightful. I would read anything that she's written. And then you read a review of the book and the reviewer loved it too. And they pulled out some lovely, luscious metaphor and you read that sentence and you swoon and you think, wait a minute. I want to become a writer. And in order to become a writer, I need to learn to write sentences like that, as opposed to, I need to learn to write the kind of story that would give sentences like that their power. And the other thing we can see when we're reading, and this is like literal, is we can see the plot, right? Because we think in story, but then we see it visually. We're very visual creatures. So it's very easy to therefore assume, ipso facto, if I want to become a successful writer, I need to become a wordsmith. And I need to come up with a rip-roaring plot, and then I'll have a story. And it doesn't work that way. So why else do we think that that's what to do? And this has to do a lot with the way writing is taught, because writing tends to be taught and people look to very successful writers for advice. And here's the thing, many of those very successful writers, they just have a natural sense of story. I mean, that doesn't mean that what they write is even better. It's just that a lot of it comes to them, all the layers come to them naturally. I mean, they're sort of like the way some people have perfect pitch. They could write a laundry list and you'd be sobbing over the plight of poorly sorted socks. They just have that thing. But because of that, they've never had to figure out how to do it. They've never had to think about it. They don't really even know what it is that pulls us in when we're captivated by a story. I mean, as any cognitive scientist will tell you, it is nigh on impossible to teach something that you didn't have to learn yourself. It would be like if someone came up to you and said, I've never walked before. Can you give me pointers on walking? And you'd go, oh my God, yeah, of course. I've been walking since I was a baby. I'm a really good walker, as a matter of fact. And then you'd kind of, you glide across the room as if you had a book on your head, right? Because you wanted to show them what a good walker you were. And as you turned around, you'd see them, rolling their eyes and they'd go, yeah, okay, I'm not blind. I can see. But how are you doing that? Could you answer that question? I mean, do you have any idea the muscles you have to move in what order and the electrical impulses? I mean, if you think about it while you're walking, you probably fall down. I mean, really what happens is you want to go across the room and your legs just take you there, or you're sitting on the couch and you think, is there still a brownie left in the fridge? And then your legs just take you in there, more's the pity. I mean, the point is, I think that's why they say the best athletes make the worst coaches. So if it's not about writing, what is it? If it's about story, what is story? And what we're going to do now is we're going to bust 4 writing myths so you can really dive into what you don't want to do, what's been pulling you astray, and what you do want to do in order to actually create a story. And after each one, if you do have questions, I am not going to pause during this. I'm going to take my whole 40 minutes and run with it. But if you put it in the, in the chat, then we can hopefully look at those questions afterwards. So the first question is, if it's not about writing, what is it? What is a story? So I'm going to say it twice, slowly, because I know I talk fast, and then we'll break it down in familiar writing parlance. Here's what a story is. A story is about how what happens affects someone who's in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal, and how that person changes internally as a result, and then can either solve the problem or sees it as something very different than they thought it was in the beginning. Let me say that again. Stories about a story is about how what happens affects someone in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal, and how that person changes internally as a result, and then can either solve the problem or sees it as something very different than they did in the beginning. Now let's break that down. Story is about how what happens. That what happens is merely the surface of the story. Yes, we're talking about the plot. And if I leave you with nothing else, it should be that the story is not about the plot. That is why, if it was up to me, and I know this is incendiary, both literally and figuratively, if it was up to me, I would burn every story structure book, from the much revered and, let's face it, deeply misogynist Hero's Journey, all the way up to the most popular story structure book right now. Because here's the thing, story structure, it's a misnomer, because it's not about story. It's about plot structure. And the story isn't about the plot. So it's about how what happens, that's the plot, affects someone. That someone is your protagonist, and that is your reader's avatar. Think of it this way: a story is a Vulcan mind meld between your reader and the protagonists. As I say to writers all the time, your protagonist's brain is the command center of the novel. In fact, they did a study recently in Canada. A neuroscientist went in and he wanted to find out, what is the thing that pulls us in when we're first pulled into a story? And he thought he would find what Aristotle said 2,300 years ago, which is it's the plot first and characters kind of second, if at all. And obviously, you know where this is going, or I wouldn't say it. And what he found was the exact opposite. When we're pulled into a story, we're not looking at the plot or the things that happen or the beautiful writing. What the areas of our brain that light up are the areas that mentalize. The first thing we're looking for is, whose story is this? Why does it matter? What do they want? What's their motivation? And that's why everything that happens over here in the plot is going to get its meaning and emotional weight based on one thing and one thing only, and that is how it is affecting the protagonist, but not affecting her in general. Like, you know, over here in the plot, it's snowing and she doesn't like cold weather, so she's going to stay and drink cocoa and, you know, binge watch Breaking Bad for the 8th time, but how it's affecting her in pursuit of that deceptively difficult goal. That is the agenda she's got, that thing she wants, but in order to get it, she's going to have to solve this problem. It's sometimes thought of as a story problem, sometimes I'll say plot problem, but stories are about problem solving. And in order to solve any problem, we have to change. And all change is hard. So they are going to sweat going through this problem they can't solve. So it's about how what happens, that's the plot, affects someone, that's your protagonist, in pursuit of a deceptively difficult goal, that is that story problem, an unavoidable problem, and how that person changes internally in order to solve the problem. And that, my friends, is what a story is actually about. In other words, the story is not about the plot. The story is about how the plot affects the protagonist. Story is not about an external change in the world. Story is about an internal change in the belief system of the protagonist that allows them to solve the problem. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, what do you mean it's about how my protagonist changes? Why does my protagonist have to change? Change from what to what? Aha, here's the thing. All stories begin in medias res, which is a fancy Latin way of saying in the middle of the thing. The first page of your novel is actually the second page. So obviously begins the second half of your story. The first half is what you have to create first, because all protagonists, all characters actually enter the story with two things already fully formed: something they want and have wanted for a very long time, since childhood or early teen years, and a misbelief that's been holding them back, keeping them from getting it until they get to that beginning, the plot, where the plot's going to push them forward and force them to go after that thing they want. But in order to get it, they're going to have to overcome and see their misbelief for what it is wrong. So what's a misbelief? You might think, wait, that sounds kind of familiar. Is that like a fatal flaw? No, it's a term I would never use again, because I mean, think about it. Fatal flaw, it sounds so judgmental. It sounds so finger waggy, like, you know, you're flawed and, you know, hopefully my plot's going to help you grow and get over that flaw. Maybe not, we'll see. The other word that people tend to use, which is closer to the mark, but I still wouldn't use it because it has a value judgment on it, is wound, right? Character enters with a wound, and that kind of makes them sound like a victim. You know, you've been victimized and maybe my plot will heal you, we'll see. I like to think of it as misbelief, because we all have them. Misbeliefs are things that come in early in life. When as children, we're trying to figure out, not to make it sound transactional, but how to get our needs met. A misbelief is a misbelief about human nature, about what we need to do to get our needs met. It's never something logistic. It's never something technical or physical. It's not like, you know what? I know that we all thought that the world was flat, and I hope you're sitting down, but it turns out it's actually wrong. Or I thought she was my mother and it turns out she's my sister. Someone's got some splaining to do. It's never something like that. It's more something about, again, how we see the world and the way that we think other people need to be treated or treat us. A misbelief would be something like, I know that people only like you if you're strong. And if you're strong, it means you can never show emotion. And I've noticed that if I feel emotion, emotions kind of leak out and it's going to show. So I realized to be strong and to be liked, I'm never going to feel any emotion. And that's going to keep me safe and make me liked. That's a misbelief. Or a misbelief might be something like, the nicer people are to you, the more they seem like they really want to get to know the real you, the more they're only doing that so they can know you well enough to manipulate you and get you to do what they want. So I've got to be very careful of people who want to know the real me. These beliefs come in early in life, and then they ricochet through your protagonist's life, keeping them often from getting that thing they want until they hit the beginning of your novel, when your plot is going to force them to go after that thing they want. That is the agenda they're going to step onto the page with, because all characters step onto the page with a fully formed agenda before they get to page one. It's going to force them to go after that thing they want, but in order to get it, they're going to have to confront their misbelief and get over their misbelief. And that connection between misbelief and desire, that's what I call your novel's third rail. That's where all meaning comes from. External problems, stories about one problem that grows, escalates, and complicates externally. And then scene by scene by scene by scene, it forces your protagonist to struggle with what they want and the misbelief that's keeping them from getting it. That is what gives your story power. That is what we come for, the internal story, not the external story. The external story is what? The internal story is what we come for, because it's why. And that's your novel's narrative thread. You often hear writers go, what's your narrative thread? And they think that that means it is the plot as a narrative thread. Untrue. Narrative thread is the internal evolving narrative that your protagonist is using to make sense of what's going on. Because again, it's not about the surface, because we live in the surface world. We get the surface. We understand the surface. Each and every one of us, no matter where you are, one thing we all have in common is that from birth until now, we have survived in the surface world, right? Yay, us. But that's not what we want to know. We want to know about what goes on beneath the surface. That's what we're always looking for. I often think of story as the difference between what we say out loud and what we're really thinking when we're saying it. Because how often is what you're saying to someone and what you're really thinking the same thing? And which one is more interesting? And which one is juicier? And which one is more revealing? It's what you're thinking, right? That is what you're thinking. And that's what we want to know about everybody else too. What are they thinking? Because we want them to like us. And that doesn't make us insecure. We're not like, I'm so insecure. I'm dying to know what people think of me. We're wired to live in a world we don't live in anymore. And we're wired to live in a world where we need to know what other people are thinking, because we're trying to figure out if they're safe or not. Are they going to clobber us or not? We want everybody to like us, counting the barista at Starbucks. It's like when someone comes up to you and says, Matilda, I'll love you forever. What's your first thought after, my name's not Matilda? It's really, can I trust you? Are you punking me? Will you still love me tomorrow? This is what we come for. We come for the inside story. I mean, I am sure that we've all heard that expression, never let him see you sweat, right? Never let him see you sweat. That in the surface world, never let him see you sweat. What does it imply? That underneath, we're sweating buckets. Story is about the buckets of sweat. I once had a student at UCLA, and she said, I know I look really put together. And she really did. She said, I know I look really put together, but inside I'm a raging mess, and I'm trying to keep all of you from seeing it. We come to story for the raging mess inside, the raging mess we don't show anybody else, the things we don't say. You know why? Because it makes us feel vulnerable. We come to see the why people are doing what they're doing. We come for that level of vulnerability, for those Me Too moments. Oh my God, I go through that too. I feel vulnerable in that way too. It's not just me. This is what we come to story for. This is where story lives and breathes. So now that we know what a story is, let's break 3 writing myths that keep us from exploring that, and certainly from getting it onto the page. So if that is what's going to pull us in, first writing myth, and this is the worst one. This is the one, I'd give anything to just completely defuse for everyone. And here it is. And I'm sure you guys have heard this. It has to do with backstory. Here's the thing with backstory. When you're using backstory in a story, anything with backstory, use it sparingly, and then only when the reader needs to know something. Could not be less true. First of all, you never put anything in a story because the reader needs to know. I mean, not that they don't know to need, that they don't, the reader doesn't need to know things, but you put them in because that's what the protagonist or point of view character is struggling with at the moment as they're trying to figure out what to do. Backstory, again, that, story start and medias res. Backstory, what happened before. Story specifically, not one of those birth to death bios that are as surface as the stories that they then give birth to. But backstory, story specific backstory is the most fundamental layer of story because it's where all story logic comes from. It's where all meaning comes from. It's funny, and not just in, and this doesn't just have to do with writing. It's not something that writers made up. This is brain science. This is how we make sense of things. And since, your characters are people, I just finished reading a book called literally Your Brain is a Time Machine by, I think it was Dean Buonamano, who's a neuroscientist out of UCLA here. And he says, and of course the literature is all over on this, that the sole purpose of memory is to record past events in order to predict the future. In other words, our brains are prediction machines. And what we use to read meaning into things and to make every prediction is, guess what? Our past. That is what we use. I mean, just think for 1 minute. Think for 1 minute. Imagine now that you're going to write a novel, right, about yourself, but you're going to use the next year of your life. So starting tomorrow, December 22nd, right, from December 22nd, 2021 to December 22nd, 2022. And we can stand here right now, and each and every one of us can go, here's what I think is going to happen during that year. Again, personally to me, here's what I want to have happen. Here's what I'm afraid might happen. Here's what I'm really rooting for and working toward. Here's what I'm trying to keep people from knowing. Here's the way my spouse, my kids, my parents, my dog, my boss, my school is going to affect me and all that. All of that we know right now. Has any of it happened yet? No. Where are we getting that information that we're using to guess about next year and what we want? From our past. All of those things we're thinking about doing are the balls in play from our past. You do this for your protagonist, and you've got the balls in play that are going to be going on into the novel. In fact, I find often that with this, the plot tends to auto-populate. This is not pre-writing. This is not research. This is writing. Again, you don't start writing on page 1 and write forward, because otherwise it's like saying, I'm going to write a 375-page novel about the most important turning point events in someone's life who I know absolutely nothing about. And you don't have to take my word for it, that this is what's on the page and this is what's pulling you in. It's there always. I was working with a writer who said, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I want to see it for myself. And the next time I talked to her, she said, oh my gosh, she said, I've been reading Sharp Objects, which is Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl. It's her first book. She said, I've been reading Sharp Objects, and I took a highlighter and I was going to highlight everything that's backstory and internality. And I'm halfway through and I've highlighted, are you ready for this? 60% of the book, 60% had been highlighted. That is the point. What you're writing here is going to be laced all the way through your novel, as no less than William Faulkner said, the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. And so that is the truth about backstory. And now the problem, though, is with that myth is that when you're told, yeah, put it on the page sparingly and only when the reader needs to know something, you tend to think, why do I need to know it at all? I'm a pantser, I'm a plotter, I'm going to go forward from page 1. And so the problem is you don't even have that backstory to put onto the page. So you've got nothing for your character to think, because that brings us to the next, I guess this is the third myth that we're going to blow up. And that is, don't tell the reader what your characters are thinking. That's the reader's job. You're talking down to them if you let them know what they're thinking. That could not be less true. It is your job to let us know what the characters, especially the point of view character, is thinking, because that's where the story lives and breathes. That's where they are making sense of everything. You can't do that without the backstory. You can only have them making sense of things in a very general or generic way. But you have to dive in and you've got to give us that internal struggle. How does backstory come onto the page? Well, that's exactly how they're stuck in every scene. Your point of view character, your protagonist needs to make a difficult choice, a choice that's going to make them struggle internally. That internal struggle is where the backstory is pulled in order for them to make sense of it. And that's all in terms of how they're trying to figure out what the heck they should do, which will always in every scene lead to a little aha moment that then leads to what happens next. I mean, this is what it looks like if you don't. And this is the problem. Writers go, I'll figure it out as I go on. So imagine now I'm someone, I'm a character in a novel, and my writer hasn't figured a lot of that sort of stuff out, but I'm still a person, right? So the chapter opens and just opens with like the doorbell is ringing, and I open the door and I see someone, and I kind of know she's like a colleague at work, and she says, "It's a beautiful Saturday. You want to go hiking?" And I think, do I want to go hiking? Do I want to go anywhere with her? What was I doing before the doorbell rang? And at that point, I'm not trying to answer any of those questions. I'm trying to figure out why the heck I don't know the answers to them. And I admit I look a little gobsmacked. And then I look and I notice she's backing down the steps because I look like I've just had like a break with reality. And the only thing I know at that point is when I get to work, whatever my job actually is, tomorrow, no one's going to be able to look me in the eye because they're going to think that I had some sort of break with reality. But that is not what happens to us ever. Here's what would go through someone's mind, whether all this would be on the page or not is not the point. But here's what goes through people's minds when something like that happens. So there's a knock at the door. I open the door and there's my coworker. And she says, "It's a beautiful Saturday. You want to go hiking?" And I think, oh God, no. I never go hiking. I'm terrified of hiking. It started when I was 7. We moved and I joined a new bluebird troop, and I wanted to show them how strong I was, not show any fear. We went hiking. I bounded up the mountain. I looked down. I didn't know I was afraid of heights. I fell onto my tush, threw up all over the counselor's shoes. I just scooched down on my tush all the way down to the bottom. It took 45 minutes. It started to rain. The bus had left. By the time we got back to the school, all of us came down with colds. I think I was sniffling all the way through 5th grade. I'm still teased about it, actually. I've not been up on so much as a step stool since. And besides, I don't really like my coworker. The last couple of times she's asked me to do something, I've said no, but I think she's in really good with the boss. And if I say no again, she might say, I'm not a team player and I want him really to like me, because what I'm really doing is I've been writing this proposal for how to run the new branch we're opening up in Paris, because the person who writes the best proposal, and I think all of us are doing this now, the person who is, sorry, something just popped up on my screen. That was so weird. Anyway, the person who writes the best proposal is going to get to manage that new branch in Paris where Jack is. And I want to be where Jack is. And I think she's running a proposal too. I wonder what she's up to. That's what happens when we're trying to figure out what to do. Our brain, we turn to the past, we try to figure out what might be happening in the moment, we think about what we might do, then we look to the future and go, is that going to help me get my agenda? And at that point, I would turn to her and go, you know what, I'd love to go hiking. I think I got a pair of old Keds in the closet. In other words, I want to find out what she's really doing. Now imagine that scene without any internality. Imagine that scene if we couldn't go into my head and hear what I was thinking. It would look like this. Knock at the door. I open the door. She says, it's a beautiful Saturday. You want to go hiking? And I would do this. Because writers always do that when someone's thinking. This is code body language for thinking hard about something. Rubbing your chin. That's what it is. Like, don't ever put that in a book. Like, don't ever say someone rubbed their chin. They rubbed their chin. And seconds passed. That's what it would say. She rubbed her chin. Seconds passed. She said, sure, I'd love to go. And did that make you feel anything? Did you learn anything? Do you have anything that you're now trying to figure out what's going to happen on that hike? Is she maybe going to push her coworker off the cliff? Who knows? Story is always internal. This is what we come for, that internal evolving narrative, which very quickly brings us to our 4th thing. And this goes to writing myth that I think tanks books right out of the starting gate. And it's this one. When you want to lure the reader in, hold something back for a reveal, because we're going to be lured in because we're going to want to know what's really going on. And the irony is that when writers do that, they almost always hold back the very thing that would lure us in. Because when they do that, everything has to be very, very, very general and have portent with no meaning or no specific or no way we could even try to figure out what it is. And here's what it sounds like. It sounds like the writer is saying to us, I know something you don't know. And if you follow into the book, maybe I'll tell you, which is as annoying as my voice just was. I hate even using that voice because it's so annoying. It doesn't pull us in. It ends up pushing us out because sure, there's some way where we want to try to figure out a little bit what's going on, but you got to give us enough information so that in fact, we can start to put 2 and 2 together and maybe come up with 4. But instead, when everything is very general, not only aren't you giving us that, but you're often having characters not be able to think about the very thing they would think about in that situation because it would give it all away. So when we finally get to the place where they can think it and we find it out, we go, I don't believe you. Like if that was true, she would have done this, this, and this, and thought of that and that, but she couldn't because it would have given it all away. You want to give it away at the very beginning, the very beginning. The first page, the first paragraph is a promise you make to your reader. Where are we going? Do I want to go there with you? Which means you kind of got to know where you're going as well. I'm going to read you and then we'll end because I know we're almost at end of time, but just to give you an example of how much you want to give away right there in the beginning. So the reader has a yardstick to really understand, I see what this journey is and I understand where we're going. And I kind of get why. This is the second paragraph of a book called The Silent Wife. And here's the second paragraph. It's written in the third person. At 45, Jody, who's the protagonist, at 45, Jody sees herself as a young woman. She does not have her eye on the future, but lives very much in the moment. Wait, hold on. Oh dear, I put this in a really weird way, but lives very much in the moment. She's keeping her focus on the everyday. She assumes, without having thought about it, that things will go on indefinitely in their imperfect, yet entirely acceptable way. In other words, she is deeply unaware that her life is now peaking, that her youthful resilience, which her 20-year marriage to Todd Gilbert has been eroding slowly, is approaching a final stage of disintegration, that her notions about who she is and how she ought to conduct herself are far less stable than she supposes. And now here, I mean, that was so interesting. We got, again, backstory that gets much more specific in the next few pages, but we're being pulled in with backstory. We're told her marriage is at a stage of disintegration that she isn't even aware of. And now the writer is about to completely give it away because the way that sentence ends is, I'll go back a little bit, and how she ought to conduct herself are far less stable than she supposes, given that a few short months are all it would take to make a killer out of her. Now we've got a yardstick. We know where we're going. Did that writer give it all away? I mean, absolutely. But that's what makes us want to read forward. Wait, make a killer. And we're also thinking like, who is it she's going to kill? What's going to happen? I mean, it's sort of like, could it be Todd Gilbert, her husband? Yeah, probably. It gives a lot away. And that's what makes us want to go forward, because we don't want to go forward to find out what's going to happen. We want to go forward and find out why. Story is always about that internal why, never the what, always the why. And the why always lies in your character's past. And the answer to everything in any story that you're creating always lies in your story's backyard. And that is in the past. And that, I believe, brings us almost, actually, you know what? I've just realized, and again, I'm talking to myself now, that the clock I've been using to do this is 5 minutes off. So I do have a few more minutes. Let me give you one more example of exactly that, which is the first line of Elizabeth George's, I'm not going to say the name of the novel, actually. Let me tell you how I even came to this. Several years ago, actually, God, at this point, like 15 years ago, I read an editorial in the New York Times, and it was by Stanley Fish, and it wasn't like an editorial about anything, political or much. It was just, he said, I was running through an airport and I was going to get on a long flight and I didn't have anything to read. I mean, can you imagine? Of course, these days, can you imagine even, being in an airport flying anywhere? He said, I didn't have anything to read, and it was a long flight. So I went into the airport bookstore, and I wanted a mystery. And I decided I was going to pick a book just based on the first sentence. And so he went through and he picks this book and he talks about why, and he never says the name of it, like at all. And then years later, I was in a bookstore and I picked up a book, and it's like, there was the sentence. And here it is. First sentence is, Joel Campbell, age 11 at the time, began his descent toward murder with a bus ride. That is the first sentence of the book. She gave it all away right there in that sentence. We knew what was going to happen. Now, here's the interesting thing. That book, and in the edition I read, was it was I think 720 pages long. The murder in question didn't happen until page 600. And here's the really interesting thing. It was never referenced again. If you had redacted that one sentence, just that one sentence, you'd be reading forward. And it's a fabulously written novel. And the name of the novel is What Came Before He Shot Her, is the name of the novel, which I guess kind of does give it away too, but not as specifically as that. And without knowing that, I don't know that you would have read the novel, because this kid, Joel Campbell, you really like him. I mean, that's sort of the yardstick. You're going, oh my gosh, I don't want him to kill anybody. He's a wonderful kid. We're so deeply on his side. I mean, you should never, ever lie to your reader, which is, of course, what happens when you do hold things back for a reveal and then they can't think what they'd actually be thinking. But even with that, descent into murder, you start thinking, maybe he's not really going to kill anybody. Maybe what that means is he's going to be a comedian and it'll be so funny that he's going to murder the audience. That's sadly not what happens. But what makes us read forward is knowing that fact, is having given it all away. We wanted to find out what would make this poor kid end up killing somebody. It's a brilliant book. It's a fabulous book. But I mean, that is the thing that you want to think of when you're starting writing anything. Give it away on the first page so that we know where it's going, so that we feel like, can we trust you to go forward? And obviously what that means is you got to know where you're going. You got to know where what is this journey going to be? Where are we going to end? What's the aha moment going to be? Where are you going? And again, aha moment, where you're going to end doesn't mean it wasn't the fact that Joel Campbell murdered somebody, right? Because we knew that from the beginning. If that's all we wanted to know, the what, we'd be gone. It was the why that we were reading for. That is what we're looking for. And now I realize I am at the end, I do believe. And so if there are any questions, I am open for questions.
We have been getting questions during your workshop. Thank you so much. I really love the idea that like specific anticipation of the why and the how is a meaningful pleasure. And that's just a really exciting thing to hear you talk about. I'm gonna go through some of the questions we've been getting over the past hour. We've gotten a couple of questions about deceptively difficult goals. Sarah asked if you could give us some examples of deceptively difficult goals, and Maggie had asked a similar question. So if you could talk a little bit more about like what that means in context.
Yeah, I mean, in context, really what that means is, I mean, we would spend hours talking about it in depth, but really what that means is whatever problem they're facing in the beginning, right, that they want to solve, they tend to think it's really pretty simple going into it, and it gets more and more difficult going forward. So that, I mean, that's really in a nutshell, everything they do to try to make it better only tends to make it worse. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about deceptively difficult goal or difficult problem. I mean, often with protagonists, if they knew how difficult it was going to be when they get out of bed in the morning, they wouldn't get out of bed. They just go, yeah, I'm going to just stay here and wait for this to blow over. But they tend to think it's something's really, really, really simple. I mean, the weirdo example that pops into my head, and this isn't from a book, but from a movie that is in my head right now because it's almost Christmas, and I think it's one of the best Christmas movies ever, Die Hard. When Die Hard opens, the main character, John McClane, thinks he can win his wife back really easily. That's what he wants. The movie's about whether or not he can win his wife back. And he thinks he can do it by bringing a giant teddy bear to her. Like that's going to do it, as if that could possibly solve his problem. His problem is much, much, much more complicated. And of course, it's almost to the end of the movie before he actually does solve that problem and realize what his mistake has been and how he's lost her and why he's lost her and what he needs to do to get her back. And what he needs to do to get her back isn't to kill Hans Gruber, more's the pity. It's that he needs to see her as a human being, as a person, and realize that her needs are just as important as his, and he doesn't have to be this tough macho guy in order to, you know, to be a strong person. That's, you know, that's where that ending is. So that would be an example of a deceptively difficult goal, meaning solving that problem. The internal goal is something else entirely that we would, again, need hours to talk about. And it's harder to, I mean, I think the thing, and one of the reasons talking about writing can be difficult is because these days we want things to be easy, and it's not. I mean, writing is hard. If it's, you know, if you're doing it and it's fun, you're probably not doing it right. I mean, anyone who thinks writing is easy instantly isn't doing. When I was an agent, and if I get a query letter that said, you know, I hope you have as much fun reading this as I had writing it, I think, yeah, I don't need to read anymore. I know that. It's hard to parse this out. It takes digging really deep. So anyway, but that's an easy answer to that question. Quick one.
And I think it leads us really, really elegantly into the next question, which is, what is the relationship between misbeliefs in different lengths of stories? For example, a short story versus a novel or a movie like Die Hard, or versus a book series or a TV series where you have so much more time to dig into a misbelief. Should the development of what happens with the misbelief be handled differently? And that question comes from Aaron.
I think that's a great question. And I mean, it just, that's a hard question to answer. Because I'm thinking in a short story, yeah, it's something where it is smaller, or it's one piece of it that suggests the whole, if that makes sense. I mean, in other words, in a novel, you have much more time to really dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the layers of the misbelief, which by that time, you know, in any story has become so absorbed into the person's life. It's not like they're thinking it over and over again, but it's in their reaction to everything that happens until it kind of finally comes to the surface. In other words, the story present is what makes the unconscious, and I don't mean unconscious in a woo-woo or Freudian sort of way, but I mean unconscious in that, but once we believe something, it gets relegated to what's known as our cognitive unconscious, and we just think that's the way the world is. We don't think it's our opinion. And then, you know, the story present forces us to question that. In a short story, it can happen like that. In a short story, it's one piece of it, and they might even be at that place. It's writ small, but it's still in the very, very, very specific. The only way to get to the universal is through the specific. In a novel, it has a much longer period of time to do it, obviously, so that you can go into the layers, you know, by definition, because misbeliefs pick up supporting misbeliefs all the way along the way, right? They grow, they escalate, they complicate. So you just have more time to do it. In a series, I mean, the series that popped into my mind instantly, because it's always seems to be there, is Breaking Bad, you know, where it goes from, what did Vince Gilligan say? He wanted to create a character who started out as a protagonist and ended as an antagonist. I wouldn't say that's exactly what happened. I think that Walter White really came into his own through all of that. And by the end, one of the best finale episodes ever, because even though he's dying, right? He's going to die. He dies in that episode, but he dies happy, because he's done what he really wanted to do and what mattered. And he found a way to do the thing that he was trying to do in the first episode, which is take care of his family after he died, right? I mean, that was his goal in the beginning, and that's what he achieved at the end. But it was really brilliant all the way through. I mean, in a series, obviously you get, you know, the other characters, because the truth is every character has a misbelief in something they want. Every character steps onto the page or the screen or whatever with a fully formed agenda all the way through. A great way to see this, I think a great series that did this, you could watch and you can see the internality and the story specific backstory is HBO did I think it was HBO did The Flight Attendant, which is a brilliant show. And it shows you all the way through why the character does what she does and why she believes what she believes. And it gets to, in the penultimate episode, there is you know, not a flashback because you're sort of watching it on two levels, but you literally see what I would call her origin story, meaning the moment that her misbelief was born. And it's like, right, I was screaming as I was watching the show. It's like, oh my God, there it is. So good.
Thank you. That's, yeah. Can talk about this for hours. We've gotten a couple of questions, which I think are really interesting, about applying this perspective into different spaces. Let's see here. Someone had asked if you have any suggestions about storytelling as it relates to stand-up comedy or comedy in general. And Anne had asked, in a business context, who do you see as the protagonist? Is it your audience, the people you want, or the people that you work with, the people who you want to be working with, people that your audience must approve of? So, I realize those are two totally different spaces.
Got it.
Maybe is there commonality between those two? Like, does this perspective apply?
I mean, I think it applies always to everything. I mean, stories about, first the comedy one, and obviously, I'm sure whoever asked this knows this. It's like we have what's known as an avidity for patternicity. From the time we're born, we're looking for if-then causal connections. And comedy often is when you break a pattern. We expect them to say one thing and they say something else. And I think that is what comedy is. And comedy, I think also, comedy goes to this place too, because I mean, there's no comedy in polite society, right? Comedy is about the stuff that we don't want to admit to. So yeah, I think comedy lives and breathes on the difference between what you're saying and what you're thinking. I mean, that can be super funny. And that's where humor often is in novels, not low-hanging fruit, but deep, dark humor, the difference between what we're willing to admit out loud and what we really think is going on. And in the business world, the protagonist is almost always your audience, the person whose mind you're trying to change. I mean, you want the two protagonists, if you're talking about in a business sense, it's got to be the person who you want to follow your call to action. That's who the protagonist is. And you figured out what their misbelief is and their opinion about what it is that you want them to do, not your opinion of their misbelief or why you think it would benefit them, but why they might, given who they are. And then you can create a story that, again, forces them to smack up against that misbelief and realize that embracing what it is that you want them to do actually, and I hate to sound so hackneyed, but is truer to their most authentic self, will make them feel good about themselves. And then they can go out and they can do whatever that thing is. The only time that it might not be them is, and I'll give you a very quick example. There's a nonprofit called Water is Life, and they wanted to bring clean water to Kenya. And apparently, I think it was Kenya. I might be wrong about what country it was, but the statistic is only one in 4 kids make it past the age of I think it's, I'm sorry, 1 out of 5 kids dies before they hit the age of 5. Right. And if I just say that it's a statistic, who cares? Here's what they did. They did this brilliant PSA where it's a 4-year-old who's trying to live his bucket list because he might not make it to 5. And it is because he's so happy. And he's like, he gives a girl a kiss and he goes on a plane and he sees the ocean. And now he's not the protagonist, he's the protagonist in that story, but we're the protagonist watching it because we're the person who can solve the problem. In a story, the protagonist is always the person who has to solve the problem, right? So yeah, in that case, it can be, but that makes us feel like, yeah, I'm going to give money to them. And I'll tell you, it's funny. I came across that writing my most recent book, Story or Die. And when I was watching it, and I thought, I'm going to use this and write about it. And I went, but first I have to donate. I can't do this. I make a monthly donation to that particular charity because it so got to me.
Oh gosh, that's fascinating. Okay, we've gotten quite a few questions about POV. Julie had asked if you have thoughts on deep POV as a writing style, and Greg asked something which I think is an interesting, building off of that is, you talk about giving it all away and making sure that the writer is engaged from the beginning so that we know where you're going. If you're in a close first person POV, how do you foreshadow that? Like, how do you offer that hook?
I happen to like first person better than anything else. I mean, it depends. I mean, because we're in their head. I mean, I don't even understand how would you, I mean, first of all, it depends on where the authorial voice is, right? If you're writing first person and it's present tense, that's a little bit more difficult, right? Because it's just what's happening. If you're writing first person where it's always, they're standing either at the very end of the story or they're 90 and they're looking back at what happened when they were 20, they can do it. The first person voice can do it, on that level. And the other way that things come in is often that first person can misunderstands what's going on. Often the reader, especially if they're very young with kids, the reader understands what's happening in the world and the point of view character does not. But I don't even, to tell you the truth, this is why I sort of eschew everything that, as I'm very fond of saying, I probably shouldn't say this, but I always say to every person I work with, if the writing world, meaning the world that gives advice, was a person, I would punch it in the nose and go to jail happily, because almost everything it teaches is 100% wrong. And I have to say, I don't even know what deep POV means. I have no idea what that would be, as opposed to just POV, meaning you always want to be in the character's head. You're always in their head. As I say to writers all the time, do you want to explain to me what's happening? Do you want them to explain to me? Or do you want to put me in their head as they're struggling with what's happening so I can experience it? That's how you get emotion onto the page. You don't get emotion onto the page with body language. vastly overrated when it comes to fiction because it's blunt force. So they're crying, big deal. I got it. I want to know why they're crying. I don't want to know that they're crying, and I don't want you to tell me they're happy, they're sad. I want to hear them struggling with what to do. And you can get that with no reference to any emotion whatsoever, but because the experience of that struggle dives into and makes you feel a certain thing, then I'm going to be able to experience it with them. And I will experience the emotion that they are experiencing. And you only get that from being really deeply in someone's head. I mean, that's what we come for. We don't come for what they do. We come for why. And I personally think that's the difference between when people go, oh, literary fiction and commercial fiction. And they'll say literary fiction is character driven and commercial fiction is plot driven. It could not be less true. Every story is character driven. Every single story is character driven. Nothing is ever just about the plot. The difference between commercial fiction, sometimes, I think genre fiction is in many ways far better than quote unquote literary fiction, which is often so deeply boring. I mean, the goal is a good literary fiction. And what it does is it goes even deeper into what someone's feeling and thinking. That's the difference. Commercial fiction sometimes doesn't go that deep and stays on the surface and is very generic. And really good literary fiction goes really, Gabriel Garcia Marquez goes really, really deeply into what the person's thinking and feeling. And that's what grabs us. That's what we're there. We come to every story hardwired to ask one question in what's known as our cognitive unconscious. What am I going to learn here that's going to help me make it through the night? What am I going to learn here that's going to help me navigate this world? And by this world, I mean the world of other people better. That's what happens. And here's the thing, you guys, we're affected by stories every minute of every day, whether we know it or not. And usually we don't. I mean, you probably heard that was it Coleridge who said, to get lost in a story demands a willing suspension of disbelief. It could not be less true. It is biological. When a story grabs us, we don't have time to go into the chemical cocktail of 3 chemicals that will grab us in that first page, which are basically, I will say it anyway, dopamine, cortisol, and oxytocin, so surprise and conflict and empathy that we have to feel right there in the very beginning. And when that happens, we're toast. We're pulled in. We're affected by stories every minute of every day. The more you understand about that, not only will the more you know how to affect other people, but the more you'll be able to see when stories might have had an effect on you that if you actually thought about it, you'd never believe the things that you now believe, because story is really how we make sense of everything, and story is irresistible.
On that note, I think that's tying so many of everything you're talking about together. It's like that's the engagement that we have with story is like, what are we looking for? And that's the hook that we're looking for as soon as we engage with it. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. And I believe we've got some slides to share with our attendees. So here you'll see the covers for Lisa's books. Wired for Story, Story Genius, and Story or Die. I've taken a writing class myself where we use Story Genius as a textbook, so this has been a real thrill to hear you talk more about what we were learning in the class, and I found it really useful and enlightening as well. I can't recommend them enough. And I believe we have one more slide that we can share. Right, so we do have a Meetup podcast, which you can scan the QR code, which is on your screen now. Let's see, there will be, as we said in the beginning, a video that's going to be shared. You can get a recap of the event. It's going to be posted in a few days on our blog at meetup.com/blog. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Lisa, once again. And happy holidays, everyone. Thank you for joining this last Meetup Live of the year.
My pleasure. Bye.